This project was a test, not because it was difficult, just because it decided to be incredibly annoying. If it could go wrong, it did go wrong. I wasn't going to post this, but I decided to do so anyway because I actually love the end dress and also because sewing can be hard work. Nothing goes perfect, even online. So this is a very honest sew with me to show even when you know exactly what you're doing, it can still take forever, but you just have to keep going. To pre-treat my wool fabric, I began with a really good steam with a hand steamer front and back. This shrinks all the fibres without causing felting or matting, giving me the option to damp clean marks and spots on my end garment. Some washing machines do have a wool cycle. If you want to use that wool cycle with your end garment, then I suggest you pre-treat your fabric with the same cycle. Always do a test swatch first. I wanted a classic 50s vintage inspired pinafore with a simple clean bodice, fitted at the waistline and then a full skirt. I drafted my bodice from my block, forming princess seams and a fairly wide V-neck. I wanted to leave room to show off the tops below. The back, I mirrored the princess seams from the front but kept a high neckline. I find this just ensures you're not fighting with the straps falling down, especially with thicker tops underneath that will catch the material. The skirt, I opted for a 3/4 circle skirt. I measured my waistband from my drafted bodice and used that as my number for my waist. Here is a formula I used for the 3/4 skirt. I won't go into depth on it here though, as it will make the video too long. If you're interested, please say so in the comments and I can do a full video on circle skirts and the maths behind them in the future. My fabric has a large repeat plaid pattern. When you sew with strong patterns like this, you need to consider how you place your pattern pieces and imagine it on the end garment. I cut my front skirt on the centre line of symmetry of my pattern and then used this to position my back skirt pieces. At the back, I aim for symmetry, not a pattern match. What's the difference? A pattern match would mean when you look at the end seams, the print would continue without any interruption, like it had never been cut. A match requires more fabric, and as this is quite expensive fabric, I decided to not go with that option. Instead, I selected to mirror the pattern from the same point, so horizontally my pattern lines match, but there is a part of the print missing. If you have the space and the inclination, by all means pattern match with every seam. Financially, for this project, I was happy with symmetry alone. Once my skirt was cut, I then moved on to my bodice with the remaining fabric. I had plenty of fabric, but when you begin pattern matching with a large repeat, you'd be surprised how it impacts. Beginning with my centre front, I positioned it on the same central line as my skirt front. That way, the pattern continues upwards from the skirt up the centre front of the body. I then worked round, continuing the horizontal lines best I could with the curved seam. To do this, I picked a point centrally and matched that perfectly. The rest of the lines were then close enough. Main fabric cut, I used it as a pattern to cut my lining. This two-tone lining fabric reminded me so much of Winnie from Hocus Pocus. The whole time I was working with this stuff, I was distracted by the changing colours. I cut the skirt shorter so it wasn't visible, and also because my fabric wasn't as wide as my main fabric. The rest I cut exactly the same and I added in pockets. As the bodice has princess seam, when cutting I selected a point on my bodice roughly at the centre where I had a notch, and I pattern matched at this point and down. I used this point to align my fabric first. It will not exactly align because this seam is curved and my pattern lines are straight, but it will be close, and when on the body it will look close enough. Sewing curved princess seams involves lots of pins and slowly guiding the fabric through. If your machine has the feature, opt to work with your needle down when not in use. This allows you to adjust the fabric and work out any folds or tucks you've created without accidentally tugging it off your stitch line. I also find curling the fabric helps to ease the shorter side to the longer. When working with princess seams, especially on pattern fabrics, I like to work in the same direction on both sides. So sew from the top to the waist, or if you prefer, the waist to the top. Any natural shifting you get due to the feed dogs and working it through will then drag the fabric in the same direction. The shifting is never much, a millimetre or so if it happens, but if your left side has shifted up and your right side is shifted down, you can visually see the difference when you have a horizontal lines in your fabric for your eyes to track it with. If you are still struggling to ease the curve of a princess seam, the next thing to try is a basting stitch close to the seam line in the seam allowance on the large piece. Use this to gather it down the slightest amount. You should have a bit more control this way. Once sewn, clip your seam allowance. I go either side, spacing out the clips so they aren't at the same point. Then I use a pressing ham to press them open. As I'm working with wool, steam shrinks the fabric and really works well on the curved seams. Here I reached big error number 1. When I clipped my seam allowance, I accidentally caught my fabric. I fixed this by placing a small square of fusible interfacing to the wrong side. Then I found a colour match thread to the part of the pattern the hole was in, and I used my machine to reinforce over the hole with a darning stitch. As you can see, there is now no visible hole and this feels secure and strong. Disaster averted. The shoulders are connected next. Then the lining fabric, constructed the exact same way as the main fabric, is placed right sides together. Align the shoulder seams, the necklines and the armholes. We're going to sew from armpit back to armpit front on either side. Then from the centre back all the way around the neckline to the centre back on the other side. All these seams are clipped. making sure you don't catch your fabric again, and really getting into that central V-dip. The back bodice is then pulled through the shoulder hole to the front, turning the garment the correct way round. It looked like it won't work, especially with thicker fabric like wool, but you can guide it through with some gentle tugs. Right side out, understitch all these areas the best you can. You won't be able to reach everywhere because you don't have the access, but the more you can reach, the less your lining will creep out to the right side when worn. Press it all sharp as a final step. The bodice is closed by aligning the side seams of the main fabric and the lining fabric on each side. Paying attention to align the midpoint where you switch between fabrics at the underarm. This is sewn in a continuous line from the lining waist to the fabric waist. The seams are pressed open to reduce bulk. At this point, I also added interfacing to the centre back seam, ready for inserting the zipper later. The waistband is interfaced before being attached to the bodice. I cut my waistband on the bias, and this was entirely to get the pattern at a different angle and break it up. I used heavy strong fusible and I cut it on the grain line. If I didn't, there would be too much stretch in the waistband compared to the rest of the garment, and it would not have sat correctly. If you are working with a pattern and you decide to rotate the fabric away from the suggested grain line, be aware that you'll likely have to reinforce it with interfacing or underlining to make it work. Align the side seams of the waistband and then work between these points. Grade the seam allowance, reducing the main fabric, which will be closer to the body when worn, to 3/8 inch. I used pinking shears to reduce fraying, but it isn't necessary. I press this seam allowance downwards. No dress is complete without pockets, so that's where I began on the skirt construction. Measuring 11 centimetres down from the waist is a good pocket placement for me, beginning with the skirt front. I followed my inseam pocket tutorial method. Links below if you want to see that process in detail to learn. I attached one pocket, then remembered that I needed to finish the edges of my pockets first. This dress will be fully lined, however the skirt lining will be free from the main skirt fabric, so I still need to treat any raw edges. I started to unpick the pocket seam I'd made. It was just pulling my lining fabric to bits, so I stopped and I took my one attached pocket piece to my overlocker machine, deciding to get as close as I can. Got halfway round and my thread snapped in my overlocker. Big error 2 just got even more hard work to fix. I detangled the mess of threads left behind and re-threaded the machine and continued to overlock all the pockets. At this point there was little light left for filming, but I returned to the task of attaching pocket bags. So the pockets are attached at 1/4 inch, the skirt edge overlocked, and then the pocket bag edge stitched back. Now I align the skirt front sides to the skirt back sides. Because we're working with a pattern fabric, it's better to work with the lines of the pattern in the fabric rather than notches or measurements. I then come across my next problem. Error-free was my own creation. When cutting pattern fabric like this, it's actually much easier and more accurate to cut it with it flat rather than folded. I wanted to try and fit my cutting process on the camera for you to see, so I tried to do the skirt on the fold and it impacted on my garment. The ironic thing is, my footage failed for the cutting of my skirt front panel, so it was a completely useless act that has just caused me time and effort. My seam allowance was 1.5 centimetres for my skirt side seams. Usually I would align the edges sewing from waist to hem with a detour around the pocket. However, that would have resulted in the pattern lines of the fabric not flowing, which is a visible feature even to the untrained eye. To correct this, I aligned my skirt front and back fabric so that the pattern matched, pinning each colour line from the waist to the hem. I then sewed as close as possible to the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance down each side. As this is a circle skirt, I had plenty of ease, so it doesn't need to be spot on. This is a solution if you mess up when cutting, but ideally spend the time pre-cutting to really concentrate on getting the pattern lines matched down the full length of the material and cut single layered. It pays off in the long run. I cut corners in an attempt to get content for you, and it wasn't required. The lining was much simpler to put together. No pockets, no matching, just 2 straight seams, sewn, overlocked and pressed. The lining and the main fabric were then aligned at the waistband, wrong sides together and base stitched in place. The centre line of the skirt front is aligned with the bodice in addition to the side seams. I purposely cut the waistband larger than required to give myself adjustment room. I don't know why I do this, it's a habit I've always had. I give myself an extra inch or two just so I have some wiggle room if I take out any seams during construction. I then snip off the excess when I overlock the centre back edge. This seam is graded and pressed upwards towards the waistband. When overlocking the back edge, be sure that all your horizontal seams, seam allowance are facing in the correct direction. The invisible zipper is put in using my method from a previous tutorial linked above. This way I can focus on step 1 on aligning my pattern and seam lines at my waist. I'm only using basting stitches so I can very easily unpick and redo if it is not done correctly. Turning over, I can inspect what the finished seam will appear like before I even begin trying to insert the zipper. It saves so much time and prevents damage to fragile fabrics. I won't go into detail on this technique in this video, as all the details are in the tutorial link. The lining is completed by hand inside. All raw edges are encased within, and the inside of the dress is as beautiful as the outside. At this point, I place the dress on my mannequin to hang it for a day or two and let the fabric settle. Level the hem whilst it is on your body or a dress form. Have a friend help you if you can. I like to measure from a flat surface upwards rather than down from the waistband. Excess fabric cut away, overlock the edge and turn it up by 1 centimetre. I hand stitch the hem in place once pressed so there is no visible stitches from the outside. When you turn up a circle skirt, you have more fabric at the hem than you do at the fold. The result is you can get a twist in your hem if you're not careful. This is why you must press. And by keeping your hem smaller, you reduce the difference. If you do want a deeper hem, you can sew a gathering thread around the base to ease in the excess fabric. Or you can even sew your side seam allowance large at the hem portion to make your reduction. Here, none of that was needed as the wool is flexible when worked with the steam. I love this dress. It's comfortable, it's colourful, it's feminine, it's got all the vintage vibes I like. It's wool fabric, one of my favourite fabrics, and I can swap what top I wear below for jumpers or shirts or blouses. I can add a belt to break up the print and accessorise it. It's the perfect transitional weather awesome dress. If you have enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe for notifications to new videos. I upload sewing tutorials for all levels along with sewing inspiration like this with pointers and tips to improve your skill. Happy sewing!